Hello and welcome to the channel. If you're new here, my name is Kaylee and on this channel I cover all things true crime, travel, lifestyle and just generalized vlogs. But you have stumbled across the true crime section of our channel. Now I just want to give a warning, true crime videos are not suitable for everybody, and if you think that you might be offended or become upset by something that is involved in a true crime case, please skip to another video. I'm sure there'll be something here on the channel that you will enjoy. Janine Balding was born on the 7th of October 1967 to Beverly and Kerry Balding. Now, she was one of 4 children born into the family, and they were a very close, tight-knit family. Janine was known as a loving, caring young woman who would just do anything for her friends or her family. She was very bright and bubbly, and she had a great future ahead of her. The family grew up in Wagga Wagga in New South Wales, but Janine and her sister decided that they were going to move to Sydney. And it's here that Janine becomes a bank teller at the State Bank of New South Wales, and she also meets the love of her life, Steve Moran, in 1987. Now, they were a loving couple, Steve and Janine, and they became engaged. They set their wedding date for March of 1989. Now, they had already purchased a home, but it was about 50 kilometres outside of Sydney, and the couple decided to rent it out in order to help pay for their upcoming wedding. But on Thursday, the 8th of September 1988, just 1 month shy of her 21st birthday, Janine's life was tragically taken in one of the most brutal ways. Janine's day had started out just like any other, and she decided that she was going to catch the train to work. So she drove her car to the train station and boarded the train, headed off to work for the day. Once her day was complete, she reboarded the train and headed back to the train station, where she would then collect her car and go home. Unfortunately, Janine never made it safely to her car from the train. She was abducted by 5 young youths, all under the age of 22. She was sexually assaulted and brutally murdered. Bronson Blessington was a 14-year-old street kid who had just been released from a youth juvenile detention centre. Now, he had grown up in a caravan park. He lived there with his mum and dad until he was 6 years old, and when he was 6, his parents got divorced. He stayed living in the caravan park with his father, but it is here during this time that he's living in the caravan park that it's later claimed he was sexually assaulted by multiple men inside the communal shower block at the caravan park. Bronson claims that this was one of the most traumatic moments of his life, and it sort of sets the stage for what his life is going to be like. At the age of 13, Bronson is practically illiterate, and he's on his 13th school enrollment. He basically just drops out in the end, and he starts selling drugs and getting into fights. He just becomes a real rat bag. Eventually, Bronson is put into an adult drug rehabilitation centre, and it's here that his attitude towards life just doesn't improve. In fact, it just got worse. After a short stay in the drug rehabilitation centre, he then begs his mum to let him come home. He wants to try and improve his life, but his mum says to him that he needs to prove that he's actually, on the mend. But that ultimately ends up with Bronson now living on the streets. Whilst living on the streets, Bronson met 16-year-old Matthew Elliott and 15-year-old Wayne Wilmot. They were also very troubled young men and would always be in trouble. They were stealing things, selling drugs, getting into fights. They really were not the crowd that people should have been hanging with. But in an attempt for Bronson to sort of show off his worth to these new boys that he's just met, he got into a fist fight with another street kid called Wayne Purchase. Now, during this fight, Bronson almost beats Wayne to death. During this fight, Bronson even hit Wayne in the head with a sledgehammer, which just left him unconscious on the ground. He really did beat him within an inch of his life. On the 8th of September 1988, these young street kids met up at the Sutherland railway station, and they met 2 additional children that had just recently sort of come onto the streets. 15-year-old Carol Ann Arrow, who had just very recently ran away from home, and also 22-year-old Stephen Shorty Jamison. Carol and Stephen were both later described as being intellectually disabled, and they were very easily led astray. Now, on the day that they all sort of met, it was also noted that these kids, they weren't actually friends. They just sort of were in the situation together that they were all street kids and they were all just sort of hanging out at the same place at the same time. They had no alliances to each other. There was no real friend bonds. They were just sort of together. Throughout the day, as they were really just running amok, they were jumping onto different trains and going back and forth from different stations. They were basically just hanging out on the train line and causing a muck throughout all the different passengers. They were harassing people who were sitting down. They were harassing people that were getting on and off the trains. They were really just making it noticeable that they were there. They eventually returned back to the Sutherland railway station, and it's here that they attempt to steal a car. Now, they do manage to break into the car, but they don't actually get it started. So one of them comes up with the great plan that they're going to wait for a woman to head towards her car after getting off the train, and they're going to steal the car with her in it because she will already have the keys. Once the group had decided that this was their new plan of attack, they fixated on Christine Wobbly, who had just disembarked from the train that she had just arrived on. Now, Christine was walking towards her car and the group of youths sort of circled around her and her car. They asked her, did she have a cigarette? And once she said no, she realized that one of them actually had a knife. She was very lucky and she made it into her car before they could sort of get any closer towards her. But she knew she had to go home and inform the police. Now, Christine, she was obviously so shaken up by this event that when she got home, she phoned the police and of course told them everything that had happened. She sort of noted that the police were like, they listened to her story, but they just didn't seem very concerned. So Christine and her partner, who at the time actually had a broken leg, decided that they would get in the car and just go down and see if the youths were still there. When they got there, they seen that they had actually started to harass another young woman who we now believe is Janine. They, of course, they had no options. They were unable to get out of the car because Christine's partner had a broken leg and was in a cast. And she couldn't get out of the car by herself. She'd only barely made it back to her car the first time. But they decide we need to do something, and they drive to the police station and explain what has happened and what they've now seen happening again. The police do take it more seriously this time, and they send a patrol car to the station. The only problem is they go to the wrong car park. The young woman that Christine had seen being harassed by this group of youths had in fact been Janine. Now, poor Janine, the same thing had happened to her that they were trying to do to Christine. They had circled around her and asked her did she have a spare cigarette for them, and when she said no, Bronson brought out a knife and threatened to cut Janine. Somehow the youths got her into the back seat of the car. Wayne Wilmot jumped into the front driver's seat and all the other youths jumped into the car and they took off with Janine. Wayne Wilmot was driving the car with Carol Ann in the front passenger seat. Now they started heading towards Mitchamberry, which is another small suburb in Sydney. During the drive, Bronson Blessington, Matthew Elliott and Steve Jamison all sexually assault Janine at knife point. When they arrive at Mitchamberry, they drag Janine out of the car and the three boys again sexually assault her. It's at this point that they decide they cannot leave Janine alive because she will be able to identify all of them. And so for their own benefit, they decide to kill Janine. Janine was bound and then thrown over a fence into a paddock. Now in this paddock there was a dam, and the three boys who had sexually assaulted her dragged her towards the dam and held her under until she had died. Wayne Wilmot and Carol Ann had decided to stay in the car at this point and were not going to participate in what the other three were doing to Janine. The group then leave Janine's body floating in the dam and proceed to drive away, where they eventually dump Janine's car on the side of the highway. Just 2 days after Janine's brutal murder, Bronson Blessington and Matthew Elliott return to the youth detention centre, and it's here that they begin to brag to a youth council worker about how they brutally beat Wayne Purchase. The youth council worker, he decides he needs to call the police and inform them of what's happened. So the police take the two boys in for questioning. During the questioning, the boys try to use the fact that they know where Janine's body is as leverage to get them out of trouble with the Wayne Purchase incident. Now the police, of course, start questioning them about what has happened, and they lay the blame on somebody else. Now, the additional street kid that the boys were saying told them about the body and sort of blamed this other street kid for the murder that they knew had happened but had nothing to do with. He actually had an airtight alibi for his entire weekend. So the police knew that the boys, they were not telling the truth, and they had a lot more information that they needed to give. With the interrogation getting a lot harder on the boys, they finally give up the name of Steve Shorty Jamison, and the police go and collect him for an interview as well. During his interview, though, he just openly tells the truth and confesses to everything that they've all done to Janine. It's at this point in time, after Steve Jamison's open confession, that all 5 of the teenagers were arrested and charged. And then 2 years later, in 1990, their trials begin and they are all found guilty. Bronson Blessington, Matthew Elliott, and Steve Jamison were all given life sentences plus 25 years. The two 15-year-olds, Carol Ann Arrow and Wayne Wilmot, now they were given much lighter sentences. As I was saying, they did not actually sexually assault Janine, and they did not murder her, but they were there and they did help try to cover it up. Now Carol, she received a 3-year good behaviour bond and time served, as they had all been incarcerated throughout that 2-year period from arrest until their trial. Wayne Wilmot was given a 9-year and 4-month sentence with minimum serving time of 7 years. Bronson Blessington and Matthew Elliott, who were 14 and 15 at the time of Janine's murder, are actually now known as the youngest Australian killers to be given the maximum sentence. Carol Ann Arrow has definitely kept a low profile throughout the years. Not many people even know where she is at this point in time. She's definitely stayed out of the public eye. Wayne Wilmot, on the other hand, did serve his 7-year sentence, but when he was released, he did start to re-offend. In 2004, he was convicted again of sexual assault and was sentenced to another 12 years. He is still currently in a prison and is not due to have any sort of release date until September 2021. The 3 boys who were all given the life sentences are all still in prison, and a new legislation was passed that they will never be released from prison. Bronson Blessington does still lodge appeals all the way up to this day. He does claim that he has now found God and is a born-again Christian. In a twist of events, 4 of the youths now claim that Steve Shorty Jamison was actually not even at the attack of Janine, and that it had actually been another person nicknamed Shorty who was there with them. They now claim that it was Mark Shorty Wells who was there and not actually Steve Jamison at all. Mark Wells was also a street kid, and a year after Janine's murder, police finally caught up with him to ask him what he knew. And it was throughout this time that he had information about the case that the police had not released to the public. He did know things, and he claimed the only reason he knew this is because he had an elusive dream, and that's how he learnt all of these horrific details that had happened. Unfortunately, his DNA was not found at the scene or on Janine in any aspect, but neither was Stephen Jamison's. To this day, Stephen Jamison claims that he is innocent and his confession was actually coerced by the police. In 2013, Janine's mum, Beverly, passed away, but Janine's family are still very vocal about the fact that they believe the 3 boys should still be in prison for the rest of their natural lives. So that is the case of Janine Balding. Now, let me know what you think. Do you believe that they were so young that they shouldn't have these such big sentences, or are they exactly where they are and they're getting exactly what they deserve? So what do you think about the shorties of the case? Now, do you think that it was actually Steve Jamison, or do you think it was this Mark Wells guy? Like, that blew my mind when I found out that sort of information. Now, all four of them had said that, you know, we lied, it wasn't Steve, it was this other guy. But he confessed. It's like, are they just using that to say that his confession and, you know, everything that he said about it was a lie and false? Or are they, you know, did they feel guilty that he's now been involved and it wasn't actually him? Who knows? Who actually knows? But what do you think? I would really love to know what the consensus of everybody is. What do you actually think? Because on this case, I couldn't pick it. I don't know how I feel. I mean, I think they've got sentences very suiting. Doesn't matter your age. You're 14, you know what you're doing. 14, you know what's wrong and right. So the sentencing part, I'm fine with them having that. But the Jamison and Wells, I don't know. If you haven't hit that subscribe button, please consider hitting it. It really does help our channel grow. Please remember to take care of yourselves and each other. And I'll see you again on Wednesday for another true crime video. Bye!